very loud.
Y'all are just loud.
As me. So, anyway, thank you all for being here this evening. I really appreciate the turnout. It's so great. If there are young people that might want to scoot up front and sit on the floor, you're totally more than welcome to do that. I'm going to just make a couple of announcements before we get started. I'm Kim Bartlett. I'm the chair of the Hot Springs County Democrat Party. This is our third public, nonpartisan educational meeting this year, and we're really excited to present our panel that will speak to LGBTQ plus issues and educate us on a lot of things. I'm going to go ahead and introduce everyone first. Each of our speakers will have 10 minutes to talk. And then when you came in, there were pieces of paper and pens on the chairs. If you will write down your questions during the discussion, we're going to come around and pick those up at the end, and then we're going to have 30 minutes of questions and answers. So if you could do that, that would be great. I also want to point out that we are all neighbors. We may have differences of opinions on various issues, but that's what makes America great, our diversity and our difference. And so hopefully everyone can celebrate that today with respect, dignity, and kindness. We hope we always show that to each other here in Wyoming. 2 suggestions. I'm a big reader, so for those of you who are readers, Roger McDaniels has written Profiles in Courage, and it's about 13 different individuals and groups here in Wyoming that have had the courage to stand against political winds. It's a great historical reference and just a very interesting book. The reason I bring it up is because Vicki Goodwin, who's one of our speakers, she'll be closing out the speakers tonight, has a chapter in this book. So you can get a bit storytelling. Woo! Secondly, Democratic Governor Dave Friedenthal has written a book called The Paradox of Plenty. It talks about economic inequality here in Wyoming, but since he's our Thermopylae governor, I just wanted to let everyone know that that's also available. You can also get that. That's storytelling. Woohoo! Okay, now I'm going to see around here so you can see all the important folk. Oh, quickly before I do that, all my volunteers who helped put tonight on, who helped bring food, who helped organize, please raise your hands. I also want to send a shout out to the 4 people who took care of our Brewfest booth Saturday. We're awesome volunteers. Thank you to Larry Elwin, Dale Horkey, Jane Norskog, and Susan Nichols. If she's Awesome. Okay, I'm going to introduce our panel. We have a fantastic panel. Immediately to my left is Kelly Bladell, the Executive Director with Safe Haven of Hot Springs County. Jennifer Cheney is a Community Prevention Specialist who leads the Hot Springs County Prevention Coalition. She's passionate about suicide prevention, loves our community, and wants everyone to feel like they belong here. Larry Alwyn is a software design consultant from Nebraska and secretary of the Hot Springs County Democrats. In the past, he's been involved with Gay Rodeo, and now, in addition to his consultancy, raises registered Labrador retrievers with his husband here in Thermopolis. Coda Babcock is on my phone. Hang on. Switching. Coda Babcock connects LGBTQ plus people from all ends of the state to affirming healthcare options, focusing on each person's mental and physical health needs. While formerly trained in journalism, he spent 7 years working with Denver-based youth HIV advocacy group, All the Tea, and Children's Hospital Colorado, which included marketing for the
Cowboy Tiger beer.
Thank you. You're going to have to tell me what that is later. For PrEP Research Study, Coda was honored with the Pedro Zamora Young Leaders Award by the National AIDS Memorial Grove for his efforts in HIV advocacy in 2018. Nels Kelly grew up in a small town in southern Montana and moved to Denver after high school. He and his husband have been in Thermopolis for the last few years. Nels knew they were gay since they were a little kid, but didn't really have a word for how they felt. Nels now identifies using the non-binary umbrella term. While in Denver, Nels helped with the local LGBTQIA+ center, and here in Thermopolis until recently, Nels and Ian had an openly LGBTQIA+ run bakery. Kim Birchfield from Worland, thank you for coming. Kim has been out of the closet and on a journey of self-discovery for 4 to 5 years now. In this time, she has come to understand herself as trans, non-binary, and also gay asexual. Recently, she has also been unpacking her autism, helping her to understand her LGBT identity as well, since for her, the two are linked. She's also a progressive Christian, very devout in her faith. She spent a lot of time studying the Bible from the perspective of acceptance in the LGBT community, and is looking forward to sharing her perspective and addressing questions as well. She thanks all of you for being here. Grace and peace be with you all. Woo-hoo. Vicki Goodwin. Vicki Goodwin is the widow of Larry Sissy Goodwin. In conjunction with Gregory Hinton, she's worked to preserve her late husband's legacy as a humanitarian and activist who wore female attire. Since retiring in 2004, she has served on several boards, including Social Justice Fund NW out of Seattle, Washington, a foundation working on the front lines of social change by building donor activism, and Jubilee House, a place for women coming out of prison to live and rehabilitate. As a result of her husband Sissy's work with Veterans for Peace, she traveled to Iraq and Central America on humanitarian missions. Currently, she is president of the Converse County Library Board and state committee woman of the Converse County Democrats. She writes fiction and nonfiction stories, contributing often to the Wyoming Writers Contests. Matson Matthey, Dr. Matthey, was born and raised in Green River, Wyoming. He attended undergrad at University of Wyoming, followed by medical school at University of Washington through the WWAMI program. He's been practicing full-spectrum family medicine in Thermopolis since 2018 after graduating residency in Fort Collins. And last but not least, Dr. Jeb Shank taught for 40 years in Thermopolis, and for 28 of those years simultaneously taught graduate classes on the brain for master's and PhD students at UW. He also taught college biology for over 15 years. Currently, he is teaching a graduate class on the brain for MSUN. His students frequently included those becoming therapists or counselors, teachers, as well as researchers. His PhD dissertation on neuroeducation, the biology of how the brain learns, made 9 discoveries about the mind-brain systems and was selected as the most outstanding PhD at UW. So we have a very well-educated panel this evening to answer all of our questions. Like I said, each panelist will get 10 minutes to present, and then we'll have a question and answer session afterwards. If you haven't gotten drinks, snacks, and you want some, move on over and grab some. Thank you all for being here. You want to go ahead and start? Now, if you just, there's a microphone right there. If you just push the button, it'll turn it on. Middle.
That's normal for me. Okay, can everybody hear okay? All right, just a couple quick questions. How many of you are former students? Let's see, raise your hand. Okay, more than I thought. Okay. And parents of these students? Okay. A few of us still around? Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to give a little bit of the biology going into the genetics. And this is going to have to do with sex and sexual orientation as we get along. One of the first things is our body, our mind, is constantly responding to stimuli that's all around us. And it's being either accepted or rejected. It's a threat or it's not a threat. It makes an instant interpretation, doesn't let you know what information it's keeping and what it's rejecting. It's either there or it's gone. Stuff that's gone doesn't have a chance to make it in the memory. Okay, so as this is going on, genes are being switched on in the brain or switched off, or in some kind of combinations. This is happening at a furious rate. Now, there's one part of the brain that's really highly involved in this. It's called the amygdala. It's right about in here, more or less. And it makes these decisions really fast about what to pay attention to and what it doesn't think is important. And basically, it's designed to save you energy. The brain doesn't want to work. It wants to do as little as it possibly can to get by. And often that's just good enough. The problem is that often leads us into trouble if we actually have to think. So, I'm going to use a very non-scientific term, and I'm going to call this energy efficient approach for lazy brain syndrome. And we'll come back to that. When we were growing up, many of us got some very good advice from our parents, and it was also plastered upon the school walls, and that was that stop, think before you act. But actually there's a whole bunch in between that think and before you act, and we'll take a look at that. The reality of sex is a little bit different than what we think. It's easy to think it's binary, this or that. But we start having some problems when you realize that there are male trees and there are female trees, and there are male and female trees. The sexes are on the same organism. Or that under certain environmental conditions, some vertebrate species can change their sex and back. And that there are other organisms like hydra and bacteria and stuff that really don't have sex but reproduce very effectively. They do exchange their genes, but it's not really a male and a female thing. So it's a little different than what we thought. It's a little bit more complicated. But let's take a look at some of this lazy brain syndrome and see what happens. I'm going to be a little bit graphic, hopefully not too graphic. But we're going to talk about the automatic responses and where we think sex is. So a guy sees a really pretty girl in a really sexy bikini. He gets an automatic response. Starts in the brain, and it goes down. Okay. There are definite responses. Most of you know what I'm talking about. In the females, they see a guy, really cute hunk, whatever, and there's a response too. In the brain, responses go down. There are changes. Okay, so the brain has a lot to do with how we perceive what's going on in terms of sex. I'm not going to go into all the organs and stuff. We can leave that for a little bit later on. But I'm going to point out one other thing. Why do guys have nipples? Anybody know? I mean, assuming you have them. Yes, ma'am?
Because they get formed before the gender does in the womb.
Thank you. Before the gender is expressed, they're already starting to form. You're kind of indistinct at that direction, at that point. Your body hasn't gone in this direction or that direction. Okay, so it's not always clear. What if those genes that control that were switched off, or damaged? Now the picture becomes more complicated. Okay, so it's not really so black and white. We have about 19 to 20,000 genes that run our body, and they're in those same sets of genes are in every cell of our body. And there are about 7,000 of those, roughly 7,000, that control or expressed in the brain more than any other organ. So it's really complicated, so complicated that we consider it, that rocket science is considered easier than understanding the brain. Okay, so sex is usually determined by, in people, X and Y chromosomes, except when they don't. And there are going to be some exceptions to this, and I'm going to maybe defer on some of that, putting Dr. Matthew on the spot. Okay, so what happens in these other situations, these errors in copying the genes? When we are reproducing cells, all the chromosomes are being copied. We hope done perfectly. But what a lot of people don't realize is in the process, the chromosomes are lined up, broken, and swapped. Now, if that swapping is equal, maybe we don't get too many mistakes. But sometimes a section gets inverted. Sometimes a section gets lost. It's over another chromosome. Sometimes a section gets broken and doesn't function. Any of those can result in a different expression in the brain. And you don't, or as a baby, you don't get a choice. You got what you got. All right. So you can have individuals who have an X and X chromosome. You can have individuals who have XXX chromosome. You can have individuals who are XY chromosome. You can have individuals who are XO chromosome. My question is which sex are they? And how do you know? One of the things that we tend to do as a culture is we look at people and assign them a gender role. It's culturally asserted, if you will. But that's our, if you will, Anglo culture. You go to other cultures, they'll have a different perception. I've had that kind of thrust right in my face when I used a term incorrectly, if you will, about a friend of mine. And there was actually a movie about her called Pure Grit. Over the res and stuff. It's an award-winning movie. And I'm not out there trying to sell tickets or anything. But anyway, long story short, is when I was talking at a program in Pocatello at the university, I said she was gay. A couple of natives in the audience immediately stopped me, and I'm glad they did. I said, no, that's not it. She's two-spirited. They perceive in their culture, they have a different interpretation, a different understanding. So we need to be, I would suggest, be careful how we impose our cultural interpretations upon other people. We don't fit in all nice, neat little boxes. One of the other things I'd like to point out, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot about this, is that when we talk about healthcare, and it's being talked about a lot in the press and stuff, the brain is part of the body, and healthcare includes the mind too, mental health care. And we're very, very poorly addressing this on a national level, but especially in Wyoming, with the highest suicide rate in the country. And this is especially true of the at-risk populations, which are, if you go with gay, I'm not using all the letters and stuff here, but anyway, the elderly, the vets, okay, and the youth. I hope I didn't leave anybody out. But anyway, it's a huge proportion of our population that we're not formally addressing at a political level, at least certainly not enough. I know that our physicians are doing some work on that. Okay, with that I'll yield. Thank you.
Hello everybody, I'm Matt Matthew. I apologize, you're stepping down from a seasoned lecturer to a public speaking novice. Buckle in. And this is going to be partially read from a paper, again, novice, and partially from memory because the other half of it found its way to the ground, I believe, between my car and here. So, as a disclaimer before I launch into this, I'm certainly not a subject expert on intersex or gender-affirming care, although I'll touch on both of those as I speak, and it does piggyback a little bit on some of the concepts that Dr. Shank was talking about. So the topic that I prepared to touch on a little bit is intersex. And that term is what we use to refer to infants who are born with genitalia that don't appear to be typically male or female, or when the appearance is different than their chromosomal sex. And within the medical community, we refer to it as differetically of sex development. And as to why this kind of occurs embryonically as we're developing up until about 6 to 8 weeks of development, everybody looks the same, male, female. Those sex hormones have not begun to exert any of their effect. And then between those weeks 8 to 10, they start to, especially the male, the XY, that Y hormone starts to produce its effects. And everybody initially has both the male and female internal organs. The Mullerian ducts, the Wolffian ducts, I flipped on the male and female there, but essentially as the male, the Y chromosome exerts its genes, those effects, it starts to produce development of the male internal sex hormones and suppress the female sex hormones. And with the absence of that Y chromosome, the female sex hormones start to develop the internal sex characteristics of a female fetus. And again, as Dr. Shank alluded to, a lot can go wrong in that process. It's a pretty intricate orchestration of genes working appropriately. And so, kind of stepping back from the biology of it, intersex, or essentially something going wrong with that process, affects about 1 in 1,000 live births, and there's tens, if not hundreds, of individual syndromes and diseases that can occur as an effect of this process not working accurately. I was just going to hone in on a couple of the more common, but again, 1 in 1,000, that's about 7 years of births or less here in Thermopolis, like the numbers we're looking at right now. So this is certainly on a magnitude that it would, we would expect to see it in and affect people within our community. So the most common diagnosis that occurs because of this not occurring correctly is congenital adrenal hyperplasia. So in that particular disease, the sex genes actually work appropriately, but the adrenal genes have a derangement to where they overproduce the sex hormones. So usually it's just the immature or embryonic gonads that are producing our sex hormones. Other tissues can produce them, and in this particular disease, your adrenals go crazy and they produce a lot of testosterone, whether you're a male embryo, whether you're a female embryo. And so if you're a male embryo, embryonically, you develop fairly normally, and when you're born, you look like a male. With a female, because you have both the female gonad and then your adrenals both producing large amounts of androgens for the male hormone and then female hormones from the developing ovaries, you end up with a embryo and then fetus that has kind of mixed characteristics. It used to be called ambiguous genitalia, and the newborn does have characteristics of both male and female external appearing genitalia. And so that's above and by far the most common of these genetic diseases that causes the at birth diagnosed intersex. And that, just as a side note, is something that every newborn born in a hospital gets screened for on the state metabolic screen. And again, with the adrenal overproducing, there's a whole slew of other issues that if you don't diagnose it early, that fetus will die. So taking a step away from the sex hormone and the sex characteristic development, there's other treatment priorities to keep that fetus alive. But if you get on the treatment, you save that baby, then it has the rest of its life to live, and it's starting out with features of both male and female. And before I jump into kind of the treatment of that, well, actually, I'll keep going with the congenital adrenal hyperplasia. You won't stick to my script. So that historically, newborns that were affected with this were pretty early on subjected to surgeries to try to correct their appearance to look like their chromosomal sex organs. So they would end up with either in infancy or in childhood surgeries to make them generally look more like a female. A lot of times that would result in destruction of a lot of their sex organs, and oftentimes, although the hope was to maintain fertility, those procedures would fail. And that's still not, that still occurs in some parts of the US and some parts of the world. Anymore, I would say the more considerate, conscientious treatment for these is raise them as normal children, otherwise they function normally, And then oftentimes they end up with their gender identity consistent with their internal sex hormones, that being, or sex chromosomes, that being XX, but not always. And reserving either the gender-affirming medication therapy and or surgery for when these patients can actually participate in their own healthcare medical decision-making. As you can imagine, this results in some pretty severe effects on them throughout their life. These are very prime patients for medical trauma, medical objectification. They don't have, this is rare enough that there's not great resources in place for them. As I mentioned, they undergo some pretty mutilating, unnecessary procedures, especially historically. The other one I wanted to touch on is actually where the fetus, the newborn comes out looking like a normal male for the most part, Klinefelter syndrome. And that's where their sex hormones are XXY. They essentially have an extra X. And they are infertile from birth. And like I mentioned, they end up looking like a phenotypic or a normal male. But because they have that extra X chromosome, overproduce their female hormones throughout development and end up with both appearances of male and female. Usually they either have delayed or they don't hit puberty. A lot of times the diagnosis of this is missed until a male never goes through puberty. And for that particular patient to end up with a, if they, for example, identify as a male, it would take some testosterone, some androgen treatment, which in a lot of states is considered a gender-affirming treatment, for them to reflect their gender identity. So I guess in a quick nutshell, I'd say it's from my particular medical perspective, to provide culturally inclusive, comprehensive patient care, gender-affirming care is necessary as a compassionate physician. And again, sorry that was a little bit disjointed, but as an overview, that's intersex.
Coda, I'm going to go ahead and have you jump in next, and you can kind of piggyback off of their comments. And
Yes, of course. Actually, this is a huge part of what Chloe's Law, also known as SF 111 in Wyoming, didn't pass, is because they actually were limiting intersex children who were able to get gender-affirming treatments to only those diagnosed before the age of 13. And most the average age of diagnosis is actually 21 for those reasons of not hitting puberty. And there's also folks who have both of internal organs sometimes, and one of them is working very successfully. So they just never find out that they're intersex until going through chromosomal testing. So Chloe's Law lost a lot for that reason, that intersex children needed to be able to access gender-affirming treatment, as well as because so many youth in Wyoming were earning on these treatments, and to suddenly take someone off hormones is really, really dangerous, as well as causes those mental health repercussions. So I'll go over a little bit on gender-affirming care and what that looks like for trans people, and sometimes this also does include intersex folks. But the standards of care and best practices do not allow anyone who's not a teenager to go through these. It is gender-affirming care below the age of 13 to 14 is exclusively you go by a different name at school, you go by different pronouns, you might use different bathrooms. It's exclusively limited to social transition, all of which is completely reversible. And 97% of children who identify as trans in their youth will maintain that identity. And many of those, that 3% who does not, never seek to transition medically. I know I personally didn't seek to transition medically until I was in my late teens, even though I came out much younger. So this is pretty common. So there are usually two routes for gender-affirming care for those typically sex infants who are now teenagers or adults. So that is, you can go on estrogen along with some testosterone blockers, which is the route for those seeking to have a more feminine appearance who were assigned male at birth, or assigned to intersex and then go through a male puberty. So that usually looks like folks will get less acne actually. They will have breast growth, very similar to what a cis woman would go through during puberty or a cis girl. So breast growth, skin softening, there's a slight deepening of the voice, just because we all know that we don't sound like we did as children. And then For the transmasculine side of that, so someone assigned a female at birth who transitions into being a male or appearing more masculine, as non-binary folks often go through either of these procedures. That is taking testosterone usually exclusively. Some folks also take birth control because testosterone does not actually prevent periods all the way for many people, as well as it sometimes it can cut your fertility in half, about 50% when you're taking it, so it's not going to cover that full 97-ish% that birth control does. So that one is exclusively testosterone, most commonly done as an injection once a week or once every 2 weeks. But there's testosterone gel that you rub on after a shower, there's patches you replace every few days. So there's quite a few options. There's also pellets that can be like medically inserted, like kind of in your, sorry I'm forgetting the word for muscles, but some muscles in your buttock region. So those are usually the hormonal options. Hormonal options are usually the only thing offered to minors. Very rarely top surgery, so a breast augmentation or a double mastectomy might be offered, but that's really not happening in Wyoming. We have one top surgery clinic that I know of in Wyoming for either group, and that one's in Casper. It's really expensive, especially considering that Wyoming has we have great insurance coverage sometimes, but usually those plans are much more expensive than they might be in other states. So keeping that in mind, most youths do not transition medically, and if they do, it's only really hormonal. But I'm going to do a quick overview of kind of the laws that we went through this past session. So Chloe's law, which would have blocked any trans and gender affirming treatment, that was SF 111. And that one failed in the Senate, I think it was only in the House that it failed, but it was kept in the drawer, which means that they just ran out of time for it. Additionally, we had the only anti-LGBTQ bill that we've passed, besides one that just reaffirmed the Wyoming Constitution's marriage ruling, and that was the last one in, I think, 50 years almost, 45 years. That was the ban on transgender girls in sports from the grades of 9 through 12. So college athletes were not impacted by this, and then basically under 13 athletes were not impacted by this. Additionally, we had the Freedom to Learn and Censorship bills. I think that was HB 87, as well as I think one other one. They had quite a few of this one. It was the Don't Say Gay bill for our state, SF 117. And both of those failed, I believe, because they couldn't answer the questions of same-sex parents and transgender parents who wanted to know if their children would be able to talk about them in school. So that was a lot of why it passed, along with the fact that parents can actually call in and ask that their child can't check out certain library books in Wyoming. So that eliminated a ton of these parents' concerns and eliminated the need for this in Wyoming specifically. So those are kind of the really big pieces of legislation that we went through. The one that people felt was the most dangerous was the ban on gender affirming care for minors, because as we've seen in other states, these often lead to bans on gender affirming care for adults as well. There were a couple states trying to ban it all the way to the age of 26, I think. And in Nebraska, it's banned until the age of 19 because their consideration of minors is different than other states. So you're a minor until the age of 19. So touching a little bit on the surgery end of things. So there are a few different types of gender affirming surgery. I personally consider cisgender folks who undergo these to be getting gender affirming procedures as well. If someone has something tragic happen to their lower regions or their chest, frequently with breast cancer, people will get reparative surgeries, and that is a form of affirming their gender. That is a form of making sure that they still feel like they are able to be seen as a woman, that they are able to be treated as a woman, that they can see themselves as a woman. So I consider those to be gender affirming treatments as well. But for the upper part of the body, there's bilateral mastectomy, breast reductions, and then also the creation of breasts, which all of those are they're not nearly as invasive as the lower surgeries. So the creation of breast tissue is exactly the same as what a cisgender woman would get. You get silicones put in through an incision. And then for the removal, this is slightly different than what someone might get if they choose, if they have breast cancer, remove the tissue and then choose not to have it operated on. Usually this will be able to preserve some of the appearance of nipples, and it looks a little bit more aesthetically attractive, in quotes. And not everyone even opts for that. Some people do get the exact same surgery, and then some people who get the reparative surgery after breast cancer also will be able to get their nipples protected as well. So it's very similar. It's just more of a masculinizing appearance. And then for transgender women, for non-binary folks who are assigned female at birth or otherwise have larger tissue, they might just get a reduction. So very similar to something done by a cis woman. And then for the lower regions, there's the creation of a vulva called vulvoplasty or vaginoplasty, which uses all the same tissue from the natal penis and just fixes it into the way that they want it to look. So this doesn't destroy any part of the body. This is simply using the organs, making sure that pleasure is still an option for that person. It's very similar to phalloplasty. You're using the clitoris, extending it, putting the urethra through it, so that it appears similarly to a natal penis. So those are the two most common for bottom surgery, and then folks will get certain organs removed. So the testes will get removed, or people will get a hysterectomy and remove their uterus and ovaries. So those are all of the surgeries that are most common. People also will get facial. So rhinoplasty for the nose. Sometimes people will remove the appearance of their Adam's apple through tracheal staving. But those are the main options. In Wyoming, we only really have access to anything above the waist. So you can go in and get organs removed. You can have a chest procedure, and you can have anything on your face. But we don't have the capacity for bottom surgery. We actually do have a trained surgeon. He just doesn't have the facilities needed to make sure that it would be safe and effective, and that folks would be happy with how things turned out. So you need many, many more doctors. You need a reparative urologist. You need an entire ICU unit basically dedicated to this work. So that being said, that means that Wyoming's youth are certainly not at risk for having below-the-waist surgeries before they turn 18. They are very, very rarely even having the chance to get those above-the-waist surgeries, and usually only in really medically necessary situations, such as if they identify that they have a cancerous gene or something along those lines. So that's kind of an overview on our legislative process in Wyoming from this past session, as well as gender-affirming care and what it looks like here.